Hey, and welcome to the show today. You're listening to Zensensa.com, Feel Your Heart podcast. And we have another really great show for you today. This podcast is made by Zensensa.com, the leading relationship institute for relationship skills and courses based on science made practical. To get the 1-hour free webinar that will give you the key skills to get a safe, intimate, and passionate relationship, just go to Zensensa.com and sign up. The link is in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and leave a review. It really helps me keep the positive energy going to make more podcasts. Welcome to the Zensensa podcast today. I'm really excited about having Diane on the show, and Diane will obviously tell us a bit more about herself in a minute. And we will be talking about abusive relationships and also different mental health disorders and how they impact relationships, which is a first for this podcast. So I really look forward to this, and also having a personal experience. This will be really interesting. So welcome to the show, Diane.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And also, would you be able to tell the audience sitting out there and knowing who is Diane, and also what got you into this whole field in the first place, and just give them a little bit about your story?
Oh my goodness. Well, my story's kind of long, but I'll try to keep it succinct. So I actually have a doctorate in the area of marriage and family therapy. It's a pretty unusual doctorate, actually. And I have been a psychotherapist, family therapist, couple therapist for nearly 30 years. I started when I was 16, just kidding. And I am also a professor. I run a very large marriage and family therapy practice program where I teach people to be therapists. And I also have a private practice in the LA area, working with a lot of couples and working with a lot of abusive relationships. And these are, I think, much more complex than most people understand. And I've had my own personal experiences that really have helped open my eyes. And it's something I would say that most professionals, like most mental health professionals, really don't get it. It's not in our training. And the ones who do understand it often don't know really how to be helpful to people who come in. So I'm really excited about this topic. I think it's really important. And I think it's just huge. And I think education, understanding abusive relationships is essential. There's so much bad information out there. And I'm hoping today to give everyone some really useful information to really help break these cycles.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Diane. And I also think often people might not even know that they have been in an abusive relationship, because if that's what's kind of become normal to them, right, then it become normalized. And I guess we can talk a bit about that later as well. And maybe we should just start with a little introduction to, some of these personality disorders like cluster Bs, like if we talk about narcissism or borderline personality disorder and how they impact relationships. Would you be able to just tell a little bit about what these disorders really are, and the cycles of those, etc., and how that might play into a relationship dynamic?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And there are, lots of different ways of categorizing them. Cluster Bs is in the diagnostic manual for mental health disorders. And in my book, I have a popular book out called Mindfulness for Chocolate Lovers. And actually in that book, because this abusive relationships are so pervasive, I actually talk about, as you're working on finding your own happiness, one of the most common things that really set people back are what I call them the snakes. And I refer to them and I include as a snake on the road to happiness, the borderline personality disorders, narcissistic personality disorder, and antisocial personality disorder. And so I think these are the three that really become what I have seen in my many years as a couple family therapist. These are the personality disorders that really mess you up. There are other ones out there, but these are the three. When you get into a relationship or you have one of these in your family, it really becomes abusive and really can derail your entire life. So let's start with borderline personality disorder. So the first thing I want to say, of the three, borderline is the only one that we really have a decent treatment for. Borderline personality disorders are known for having very unstable mood and relationships and identity. But virtually everyone who has this diagnosis has a complex trauma that was not treated properly. So it really is, people are beginning to look at this as a complex trauma disorder that's untreated. And if the person wants to get treatment, there can be help. Many of these people don't because they're so used to this pattern, but it is the only one that's actually treatable. But when you get it, they have this profound instability in their identity. And so when you become in relationship with them, they kind of put their claws in you, and they can use a lot of manipulation, guilt, and blame to really keep to keep themselves stable. And so they're very difficult people to be in relationship with because of this. But there's usually a lot of drama because the drama to them feels normal. They need the drama to feel because if you grow up in a house that's very chaotic, the drama and the chaos is the norm. And when it's quiet, you're kind of sitting there waiting for the drama to happen. So and so they don't like being on pins and needles and being surprised. So they just keep creating new drama, and it makes them feel alive. And it's just part of what they need to actually feel stable, paradoxically. Even though they hate the drama often, they also cannot stop themselves from creating it. So narcissistic personality disorder, you hear a lot of people talking about narcissism these days. And so there are just narcissistic traits, and then there's the full-blown disorder. And so it's important to kind of, you will see a lot of people exhibit these traits. And I will say, when working with a lot of couples, that when couples go through divorce, a lot of people act borderline or act narcissistic through the divorce because it's threatening at such a survival level. But the personality disorder, you're going to see these behaviors across relationships, across time, not just in times of high stress. But the narcissist really requires an unceasing admiration from everyone around them, and they really lack empathy. So for the narcissist, they need that attention, and yet they're not able to be empathetic with anyone else. And it is like this black hole that you just cannot fill. And so the narcissist, it's really like the name implies, it's all about them. And they will, and all these personality types are actually usually pleasant if you give them what they need. Okay. It's that the problem is that their needs are totally unreasonable and unsustainable. But so the narcissist can be the most charming and delightful. All of these types are charming personality types. That's how we all get drawn in. But the narcissist, if you don't give them what they need, they can be very vindictive and punishing on the other end. And then the third type is the antisocial personality disorder, which in criminal justice literature is often referred to as a sociopath. And we normally think of the sociopath as some kind of crazy guy, going around killing people. It's really more of a psychopath, which would also qualify for antisocial personality disorder. But the antisocial personality disorder lacks not only empathy like a narcissist, but they also lack a conscience, a sense of doing wrong to others. They really don't have a conscience. And in many ways, in working with these types and people recovering from relationships, I would say that narcissism and sociopathy actually exist almost on a spectrum. And that you will see that if you push many narcissists and make them feel unsafe, you'll have some who will have a lot of antisocial traits. And it's interesting, the antisocial personality really, they work off the compassion of others, and they use the pity play to manipulate. And they really are the master manipulators. Borderlines and narcissists can be, good, are also very manipulative, but the antisocial is typically a master at it. And if they're highly intelligent, they're very hard to actually identify. There's some Harvard researchers who estimate that 4% of the population actually qualifies for antisocial. And these are people who ultimately, they just want to manipulate people to make their life easy, whatever that means for them. And some of them need admiration, some of them need love relationships, some don't. It's whatever they want, but they're going to manipulate you to make their life easy, and they don't care about how they destroy your life in the process. So those are the three snakes I like to refer to. And they have a lot of overlapping characteristics. And so that's why, and if in a relationship with a narcissist, you might notice some of the borderline traits and sometimes some of the antisocial traits, because there's a lot of the charm and the basic abusive pattern is very similar with all three.
Yeah, thank you so much for that breakdown, because then at least I think everybody out there listening can follow a bit with us more as we progress through the podcast. And I also just want to add to this great breakdown you did that, especially I know for borderline, the core of their condition is both a intense fear of abandonment and also
Yes.
emotionally dysregulation. They simply cannot regulate their
Yes.
emotions, right? So they feel them much more intensely. And I almost compare it to they're erratic and extreme like a child. You know, my 5-year-old daughter, she will say, "Oh, you're my best friend. I love you. I want to be best friends forever." The next day something happened and she'll come home and say, "I will never speak to this person again ever." And that's very much how, I experienced when I was dating somebody once with borderline, to have exactly this erratic and extreme change, that just what they feel in the moment is their reality, and their cognition at that point doesn't really work where they can see the whole picture of you as a person and your whole past, and that this is just something happening right now, right? Because emotions are so intense. And, at least for me, and I heard a lot of people describe that, it really feels this idea that you met your soulmate, because they're so good at this mirroring of understanding what you like and fit the identity to that, right? So it seems like you met this perfect person. It often feels so intense in the beginning and often really quickly. Again, as I heard, and many people have this experience that very quickly they will talk about big commitments, whether it's moving in together, marriage, having kids together, and express very intense emotions of affections of love, because you become this favorite person that is idolized. And I think the narcissist is very similar in the beginning, right? So like you said, they can be very addictive, because for some people they fulfill that need and makes us feel incredible, right? And I just think it's
Absolutely.
important to know that when they are stating commitments, this is what was important for me to realize afterwards. It's not always necessarily that they lie. They could be they're manipulated, but not all of them. Sometimes they feel that intensity in the moment, but you need to realize, like a child, it's just in that moment. So when they say, "Oh, I want to be with you forever," it's just like that child feeling good in that moment. It doesn't mean tomorrow that could totally change. While for a more stable person, that would be a sign of commitment if you say that. And again, because
Hmm.
it's erratic, a lot of people get so baffled, I know, at the end, and so did I, when it kind of goes to them start devaluing you. And then there's this sudden change that often come out of the blue, right? Because we've been put on this pedestal, and suddenly yeah, it goes the other way, and suddenly they devalue because they want to, push you away. And then very common again was this sign that they would just, not always, but for a lot of borderlines, that they will just block you, block contact, and instantly replace, because they need somebody else to soothe in their emotions and feel that sense of identity. So I just wanted to add that for people sitting out there and thinking, have I ever experienced this? These are some of like the common experiences that I know a lot of people have.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think with all three of these types, they will be the most charming person you've ever met. They are that is, and that's what keeps you kind of usually stuck in those relationships or sucked back into those relationships, because the high that everyone gets when they first meet, and it is so intense and it feels like a soulmate, you feel so connected. It is just magic. And you feel closer off, and there's this sense of intimacy. And I think there is some real intimacy there. There is a level of intimacy and sincerity for many of these people. There are some types, particularly the antisocials, who are consciously manipulating. But for many, of these abusive personalities, they're sincerely, when they're saying it in that moment, they really do mean it, like you're saying. Can they be consistent with that? Absolutely not. The borderlines, emotions, are so unstable they can't. And the narcissist can only feel those feelings, and the sociopath, when you're giving them what they want. And as soon as you stop giving them what they want, they feel totally entitled to destroy you. And so it's true in the moment. Um, and because the narcissist and antisocial personality or sociopath, they lack a real ability to have empathy for others. When they say they love you, it's not what a normal person would mean by those words. It's true for them. but it's not what you think it actually means. And similar with the borderline, if you don't give them what they want, they turn on you. And can be very, very vicious, kind of like you were describing. But there's a cycle with the abusive cycle. Maybe I should jump in and speak a little bit about this, because I
Yeah.
think this is where helps put all those pieces together. So the abuse cycle, we normally think of this, and when looking at physically abusive relationships, but the exact same pattern is evident in emotionally abusive relationships. And so when you're in a relationship with one of these snakes or personality disorders, um, you are going to find that there's a basic pattern. And so the first phase is typically called the honeymoon phase. And this is just roses and fireworks and intense chemistry. You'll often have the most intense chemistry with these people. You've never felt this great in your whole life. The honeymoon phase is intoxicating. It's magical. It's wonderful. So that's the honeymoon phase. And typically, and this is often when, like you were talking about, those early promises, that's a huge red flag. If someone you're dating wants to talk long-term plans within 2 or 3, dates, that is a red flag for one of these personality types. So but typically this will last whatever, 2, 3, 6 months, and then you start moving into the tension phase, where there starts to be little criticisms and shutting down and closing you out, stonewalling you with icy coldness because you're not giving them what they want. And so then the tension begins to rise. And at a certain point, there's what they might call an explosion, which is often either a fight or some kind of big incident, right? Where the personality disordered person or the snake needs to, like, gets called on their behavior. And typically after that, they will say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it. Apologize, apologize. I'll change. This never happen again. Promise, promise, promise." And then they get put back on good behavior, and you go back into that honeymoon phase. So in the honeymoon phase, you're on a pedestal, and it feels good to be on a pedestal. Let's face it, let's be real with ourselves. It feels good. That's why you keep trying to. So you're on the pedestal, everything's great. You're back into that magic phase. And then again, something starts happening, tension starts rising, and then there's an explosion, apologies, and then you round and round you go. The longer you stay in it, the shorter the honeymoon phase is, and the less exciting, and the fewer roses there are, and the fewer fireworks there are in that honeymoon phase. And I have definitely worked with many couples where the honeymoon phase almost totally goes away, and it's just tension and explosion. That's really very sad to see. But but in that tension phase, you're living on eggshells. Okay, and so when you find yourself on eggshells with your partner, afraid of what to say or do, am I going to make them, changing everything so you don't upset them? And you do have to ask, is this some of my old stuff, or is it really because this person is so punitive when I don't give them what they want? And that's your sign you're in a relationship with an abusive personality. And and so that is the cycle that it's very important to be on the lookout for and be aware of.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. And also, I think we talked a bit before we started the podcast here about this idea of us often believing that it's love, and often when suddenly the cycle turns abusive and nasty, then we keep thinking, oh, but I really love this person, I really love this person. And it's really quite important, I think, to come to the realization that actually we are stuck in an addiction, because it becomes an addiction, this push-pull dynamic, right? Of being pushed away and punished, and then suddenly being taken back and given this affection, and it end up becoming this high that we seek to get back. It literally, that's why, like I said, I refer to it as an addiction, like a drug. You want to get that high, and then you feel so bad, so you crave that high so much, and it create the same chemistry in the brain as well. I know when they scanned and looked at addictive behavior. And I think it's really important to become clear about that. This is not love, it's addiction, because it needs to be treated in that way. So I just wanted to bring that in there, and I don't know if there's something you want to add in regards to that.
Yeah, and I think what I've noticed is, because many of these personality types have a really clear Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. They have the charming, amazing side and the very punitive, punishing, harsh often crazy side. And so what happens is they play on our better natures, our compassion, forgiveness. They're highly attracted to very empathetic people. And they play on that, and we there's this hope I see in people that this person's going to somehow magically change with just more love. Of if I can do my half better, and that this person wants to change, you're going to go to therapy. It's going to make it all better. And so there's this very false hope that gets placed in that honeymoon charming phase. Um, that is how I think people talk themselves into going around that cycle one more time. And it does become very addictive because it's so convincing. I think an important thing to understand too, with these types, especially the narcissist and the sociopath, some of them are what we would call pathological liars. And what that means is that they actually believe the lies they tell. If you hook, that's why you can't use a lie detector test, in courts, because so many. If you're a sociopath, you will pass those lie detector tests because you believe them. You don't get the anxiety that a normal person would get when telling a lie, and that's what the lie detector test is picking up on. So they are so convincing when they say, I am going to change, because many of them are not lying. They don't give off any of the normal cues that that they're lying. And so you naively want to believe because it's what you hope for. And so this mix of hope, this mix of they are telling the truth in that moment. The important forget it's the irony, the paradox here is that forgiveness is essential for healthy relationships, but it gets played and abused in these relationships in such a crazy way. And it's that addiction really is a hope that this person's going to change. And it's a falsely placed hope because you're not looking at the full picture. You get Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That's the package. And when I work with clients, so often that's what they have to accept, is that both of those people are who they're in a relationship, not just the good one having a bad day.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And also you started kind of talking about this a bit about the people that borderlines and also narcissists, etc., and these cluster B personalities, who they attract. Or maybe it would be interesting to talk a bit more about what personalities that get drawn to each other and why. So why is it that, like you said, very empathetic people get drawn to these? And I also found it's often people that have some kind of wound themselves, where this validation, intense validation that is given in the beginning is so seductive, while for other people that might be a bit more securely attached, it would just feels like a bit too much. So there might also be some vulnerabilities there, right, in the people that are being attracted to cluster B personality disorders. And I guess, yeah, what are they looking for, these people that have narcissism, borderline? That would be interesting to discuss a bit. What brings these kind of people together?
Yeah, so there's several different possible configurations. The truth is, anyone can get attracted to one of these personality types, and so it's important, I think, for everyone to know, no matter how successful you are, how together you are, anyone. And I think a big part of that is one of my, I do live in the Los Angeles area, but the Hollywood love stories. So if you believe in any of those Hollywood love stories, most of them, and so many of our quote unquote love songs, are really honeymoon phase. You're in a relationship with an abusive personality. And so unfortunately our love songs in Hollywood give us all of the wrong ideas of what healthy love looks like. And I mean, I literally go through and thumb down, on my radio stations, any song that's I'm like, oh God, that's just a first phase, honeymoon phase, batter, or an abusive personality song. So you really have to be actually careful about what type of media you take in that gives you a roadmap for relationships. Um, so truthfully, anyone can be drawn in. There is a very classic, actually, couple, which is the borderline narcissist, is a classic couple. And as a therapist, when they're in the room, because it's a much more difficult way to do couples therapy. Um, but yes, anyone who has, like you were mentioning too, anyone who's highly empathetic or who has their own wounds, there's a lot of self doubt. The euphoria, true euphoria you get in that honeymoon phase, and this just 110% validation, that sense that this is someone on the planet really understands and appreciates and validates me is intoxicating, and it draws you in because it's the often many people will say, that first honeymoon phase with this person, was the best relationship of my life, and you keep thinking you're going to go back and recreate that. Unfortunately, it's just not part of the package.
Yeah, I think, yeah, again, thank you for that. And also, one thing that I think I want to bring up, because again, what can be difficult sometimes, because that it has this intensity and it feels so good. Like you said, we often think of abusive relationships as somebody who's just really aggressive or nasty, and that's how they just are. But you're right, most of these really toxic relationships start with somebody being the exact opposite. They are the most loving, charming, intense, and even show lots of care, etc. That they seem to care about your needs, seem to be interested in the same thing as you. They seem like this amazing, perfect person. So, what are some of the signs that people can look out for before they get dragged in? Because I guess the challenge is, once you invested a lot of time and been with someone for 6, 12 months, and it's much harder to just leave and get out, even when you start seeing the warning signs, right? So what are things to look
Ab-
out for in the
yes.
initial dating phase to maybe be able to see that there's something here that's not quite right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm gonna answer that question, but before that, I'm gonna just touch on a metaphor I use to help people understand sometimes what happened to them. Because yes, no one gets into these relationships. It gets into an abusive relationship and it starts that way. And there are very subtle warning signs. And the metaphor I use, I don't know if it's scientifically correct, but the metaphor I think helps people understand. If you put a frog in a pot of boiling water, it's going to jump out immediately and survive. But if you put a frog in a pot of cold water and you slowly turn up the heat, the frog just keeps adjusting and adjusting and adjusting until it boils to death. And that's what happens in these relationships. They start off beautiful, and there are very few signs sometimes. So one of the earliest things you're going to see is that there's this victim mentality, and it can be very, very subtle. It's very convincing, and in some ways they usually have a point. But you'll notice that they are a victim when anything goes wrong. They're the victim somehow, and so noting that pattern and that not taking a lot of responsibility. Now, sometimes they will verbally, if they're smart and they've been to a therapist, they may verbally take responsibility, but their actions don't match that. And so you'll notice that their words and their actions really don't always match up very well. So that's one thing you're going to notice is just this victim mentality. It's subtle, but that's one of the first signs you get. The other thing you're going to notice is what we call splitting, which is the tendency to see people and events as all good or all bad. And so there's not a lot of shade of gray. They don't see complexity in people. And so the borderline is a classic splitter, right? And they're the ones who you're like the best partner in the world one day, and then you're the worst the next day. And they go, but you'll notice they will do that with other people, other events, that they don't see people in their complexity. And so you can sometimes note that splitting. I would say the absolute charm and just being too perfect, it's like it's too good to be true. Well, it usually is. If it's too good to be true, it probably isn't true. So they're just so perfect. And some of these people will read your online profile, and I swear to God, they will morph into whatever you ask for to woo you. And especially some of these antisocial personalities, they will just become that to manipulate you because they think you're going to give them whatever it is they need, whether it's you're going to financially support them, or you're going to give them the love they need, or you're going to take care of their cooking, do their laundry, whatever they think they're going to get from you. Um, so those are some of the, moving really quickly, as we mentioned earlier. They all of three of these types like to move the relationship very fast before you figure out who they are. And so that's another sign. But there's this intense, and just even the intensity of the chemistry that you experience. Um, it's not always a warning sign, but it's like a yellow flag that you might be in a relationship with one of these people.
Yeah, that those are all really important things and really good because I think they're possible to actually see. And also, like you mentioned, the victim mentality. So I also sense there's often this tendency that they talk bad about other people, their past relationships. People have done them wrong, right? That
Yep,
past partners have done them
exactly.
wrong, this and etc. etc. And often there's this tendency of, I know especially with borderline, that there's this short-lived relationship. So there's probably been a lot of short relationships in the past. And interestingly enough, often I found that a lot of people with borderline actually are happy to reveal that they had these many short relationships. So that again should be a warning flag. I think, why do they have so many short relationships? Um, for me, I know personally, I noticed the tendency to block people, which again seemed very extreme to me, while I was presented with this warmth and affection in the beginning that made me think she was such a loving person. Then, yet, just in the first 5 months of being with her, she had blocked five people, and I've never blocked anyone in my life. So I just thought that's so extreme. And she said to me, I should
Yes,
block my exes. And I thought, but that's so extreme. So there will be this very extreme kind of behavior.
yes,
Um, like you said again, the going between, oh, I love them so much, to they're devalued and now they're seen as all bad, right? So
yes,
she talk bad and they will
yes.
be blocked out of their life. And again, those I think are good warning signs. I didn't know that at the time. I don't know that now.
I know.
And like you said, also the victim mentality means that very quickly, like very, very quickly, they will share very vulnerable, like their traumas with you.
Yep.
And again, that's what I experienced. And again, that elicit my empathy, and that's kind of why it happens too, right? Because that draws you in and want to take care of them and protect them, etc. But it happens really fast, and there's nothing wrong. I advocate vulnerability myself. It's so important for intimacy. So it's not to say that people listening out there, you shouldn't be vulnerable and share things with your partner. It's great to do that, but what I'm talking about here is the intensity and how quickly it happens. It was happening already on the third date to hear about
Yep.
severe sexual trauma, and it happens so quickly, like you said, playing into that I'm the victim and the world is so awful to me. So I think those are just some, yeah, I just wanted to add that too, to what you were saying, to some warning signs to really try and look out for, to think, oh, is something happening here? And also, even though they might be super affectionate towards you, sometimes it's possible to pick up how they talk about other people. I know for me, when she talked about her ex, she would be so loving and talk so lovingly to me, etc. And then suddenly, when she talked about her ex and I asked why they split up, she would start laughing and say, oh, he got cancer and I don't have time for another child to look out for. And something in my
Wow.
stomach, yeah, and I wish I'd listened to that red flag. And
Woo. Yeah.
I kind of dismissed it and thought, or maybe I heard that wrong, or because it felt so good at that point, right? But again, a
Yeah.
big warning sign that somebody is able to again switch and suddenly be so cold. Again, that's not normal human behavior for somebody emotionally stable. So some of these things might pop up if you notice and hear about their past, and it's just good to be able to look out for that.
My general dating advice I've given for years, is actually marrying advice, is when you look at a person and look at how they treat the person they like the least on the planet. Because if you decide to spend your life with this person, one day that will be you. And I don't care how great their marriage is or the relationship is. At some point, your lives get stuck together, and one of you wants to either move or change lifestyle or whatever it is. And the other person become at some point your partner's always enemy number one. Some decision, something in life, and you got to look at how they're treating the people they like the least on the planet, because that will be you. And that's just general: who to marry, who not to marry, who to date, who not to date. And when you see cruelty in a person, it should be a bottom line I'm walking issue when you see cruelty. And cruelty is typically what you will see in more of a narcissist or an antisocial personality.
Yeah, and I really like that point actually you bring up, because you're right. It's also good to see how do they talk about past partners, because one day that will, that they will be
It might
upset
be
with
you.
you, and you will be described in these terms. So do they talk? And also it shows whether somebody have the ability to have that emotional maturity, that relationship doesn't work out, are they able to still get on with
Yes.
past partners and do it in an amicable way, or again, does it have these dramatic extreme breakups? If that's a pattern, again, that I think should be a warning sign, right? that there's something going on.
Absolutely.
Why is it always so extreme? Why do people always get blocked? Because in an emotional, stable, and mature relationship, even when things doesn't work out, it doesn't go to that stage necessarily. Um, so I think what I want to talk a bit about is now if people are in these kind of relationships, and as we talked about, it can be so addictive because it feels so good, and suddenly we get devalued and we start being put down, and maybe they withdraw from us and start this pattern of breaking up and then coming back and being nice and breaking up, and we start feeling anxious and walking on eggshells, all that stuff you described. But we so much want that good feeling back, and we think maybe, just maybe, if I help them, they will go back to that stage before where it was so loving. How can we break that cycle of addiction? Because it's so powerful, right? And it's why people keep going back until they get stuck in that trauma bond where they go back to something that's basically toxic for them.
Absolutely. So I do think, and I've worked with many clients trying to get out of these relationships, and I think education is real important, like what we're talking about today, and understanding the abusive personalities, how they work, and so that you can see the cycle when it's happening to you, and you can see what's going on clearly. So I think education, reading books, going to a therapist, or even finding a friend who can be a sounding board, who you tell the whole story to, not just the honeymoon part, because many people hide this from all their friends and family because they're so embarrassed. So you need to be telling the full story to one of your friends, getting a reality check, because you need a reality check. Because what happens here is you begin to lose your sense of what's up, what's down, your own reality. And that's often gaslighting is this technique where they get you to question your reality. That's why you stay partially too. You get really confused. It's like being in a hall of mirrors. You can't tell what's real and what's not real. So you need to get external sounding boards for yourself. You need to educate yourself so you can see what's going on when it's going on. And you then really need to work on your half of that cycle. You need to work on why do I let myself be on eggshells? Is this what I want to be doing? Am I just going to be myself? Am I going to keep hiding or not? Why am I doing this? But what other relationship or childhood experience has me living on eggshells for someone? Where did I learn to do this? So cleaning up your half of it. And if you're in one of these relationships and maybe it's not too severe, you're not sure how to go, hard to know, educate yourself, get a good sounding board, and then work on your half. How do you do not become part of this crazy cycle? How do you figure out what your bottom lines are, how you're going to be treated and not treated, stand up for yourself, and then let that other person do what they're going to do. And then you make your decision from there. But you need to focus on getting yourself clear, and yourself not being pulled into the crazy making delusions. And you need to figure out what the reality is and take responsibility for your half of that.
Yeah, thank you. And also, what I would add is I really like the idea of being compassionate towards ourselves, right? Because it's easy to start blaming ourselves for what's going on and thinking it's our fault. And I hear that often, that people say, "Oh, maybe I did something wrong, and maybe I triggered this, and maybe I should do something to make that person feel better." There's nothing you can do to change their mental health issues. They can, like you said, for borderline, yes, they can get treatment, but if they don't want that and they don't even acknowledge that there's an issue, then there's nothing you can do. And like you also said in the beginning, it won't go back. And I think that realization is really, really important. It only get more and more toxic. It's not going to go back to that honeymoon stage. It just doesn't happen. It might happen small bursts when they suck you in again, and then it will start over again and get worse and worse. Um, and also, one thing I thought about here as we were talking was that, while it's good to know these patterns and be able to avoid it, and maybe even be able to break the pattern, it might be that somebody's stuck in this relationship and they have children and they're not willing to leave. Or it could be that it's your child that has borderline, and maybe you, for good reason, you don't want to cut all contact to your child, etc. What are ways to then be able to cope if you still need to at least have some kind of relation with this person with narcissism, borderline, or antisocial behavior? What are ways to try and help them calm down their excessive and negative emotional responses, so it's not as terrorizing to be around them?
Absolutely. The truth is, we all work with lots of people who fit these categories. They're all over the place. So you have to get good at managing them. It is actually a good way to think about it. You need to help manage them. And the number one technique I recommend is what I call, you're going to set boundaries with zero emotion. You're going to very matter of fact, very calm, and in fact, if you can, compassionately setting very clear boundaries that you will 100% of the time absolutely defend. And you don't, there's no drama, there's no blame. This is what I'm going to do, or this is what I will tolerate. This is what I won't tolerate. And if, they do something you don't want to tolerate, you have to have some kind of consequence or response that you're going to do every single time. But you have to set clear, compassionate boundaries, and really not discuss them too much. Just deliver the news that this is what I will or will not do. Um, and so and so I think that, and if you can keep your emotions very calm, they will escalate because they're going to try to draw you back into the dance. And they're going to go more and more extreme. Borderlines are very famous for, when you finally set boundaries with them, yes, they will go try to, commit suicide. And so that's a really tough one. It really is. So you have to calculate that into whatever your response is, or what your plans are, what your boundaries are. So you need to think through them strategically. But once you draw that boundary, you need to just calmly defend it. And what happens is, with people like that, they don't mess with after a while. Once they realize you aren't going to play their game, the drama will eventually calm down, but it escalates in the beginning because they're testing you, and they're doing it, pulling out all their high cards to pull you back into the game. So I think that just very calm, clear, simple, non-dramatic, non-blaming, non-attacking, just, this is what I do or don't do, and that's the end of the discussion. And then especially if you're in a marriage with someone like this, and you're not in a position to leave, to definitely have an external sounding board. I guess any relationship, to have an external sounding board who validates your reality, because so much of what keeps this cycle going is you're questioning your own reality and perception. So you need to have a sane reality testing friendship or therapist who can help you through.
Actually, that brings me perfect on to the next point, because I think we mentioned gaslighting, but a lot of people out there might sit and think, what is this all about, etc. And I know, even though it's more popular now, I had never heard the term when I first heard it. So for me, it was like, what is this gaslighting? Could you talk about what it is and how these personality disorders use that? Because I think one of the most disturbing thing about these relationships, and what is makes them so hard to recover from, is the gaslighting, because it creates the world feels very uncertain if we suddenly start doubting our home reality, right? And I often find that's what maybe mess people up the most, that afterwards, when a relationship ends, they literally doubt their whole reality, and what was real was not real. I spoke to a woman who just come out of a relationship with a borderline, and she said, I've always been told by everyone, past partners, that I'm so loving and kind, but maybe I am abusive. And she started believing the stuff that the borderline that he had put on her. And I just think, yeah, so if you can talk a bit about gaslighting and how it actually works, so people might be able to recognize if they are exposed to this.
So yeah, gaslighting is getting someone to question their own reality. And sometimes the term actually comes from an old movie where the man was consciously turning down the gaslight, and she'd be like, it's darker in here. He goes, oh, no, it's not. It's the same as it's always been. So sometimes it's very conscious like that. But I think a lot of these people do forms of gaslighting that are, they're not even, they're so lost in their own delusional worlds, their own mixed up realities, that they really believe what they're saying. And that's why they're so convincing, because they truly believe it. But so gaslighting is when they're getting you to doubt your reality. And sometimes it's by, often it's saying, something didn't happen, or they didn't say something, or, that, you're saying I used a tone that was this, and that's not what happened at all. And so there's a lot of like getting you to question yourself. And one of the other real signs when your first argument with one of these people, any one of these types, what you'll find is one of my favorite conflict moves that they do is you go to tell your partner that something they did hurt your feelings or you want them to change something. And they do this crazy making spin where they turn it all around. You're the cause of it. You're the problem. You're the real problem. And you actually have a bigger problem. And then you find yourself at the end apologizing to your partner. And your concern, your initial concern that started the whole conversation or argument, never even gets addressed. And in fact, you're to blame for that too. And so it's this like, whoa, what was that? Um, and so that type of response, I would say also is a huge red flag that you were in a relationship with someone who's going to be very psychologically abusive. And it's just another form of gaslighting. So there are the sociopath will sometimes do it truly intentionally, like in the movies. But many of these types, and it's also because they have like the borderline has such unstable like identity. They will totally deny the other who they were yesterday because there's someone totally different today. And so they make you think you're the crazy one, but you're like, whoa, you did this yesterday, you did this today. They're totally contradictory. And they're like, I didn't do that. That you totally misperceived that. That was you not understanding what was going on. And so you get that type of stuff all the time. And so you begin to question yourself and your reality. And as I can tell you as a therapist, both of I will tell you it's true both for these abusive personality relationships, and also when you've recovered from even like sexual abuse or physical abuse as a child. The thing I have to treat, the number one aim I do for all of these types of forms of abuse, and in some ways I really see it clinically as like the heart of abuse, is getting that person to hear their inner voice and trust it. And so I do a lot of work with people. It's like, okay, when you were in those early stages of the relationship, and you heard her say that she left the last relationship because guy got cancer, and where did you feel that that part of you that said something's wrong? That was the voice you didn't listen to. Where is it? What did it sound like? Where did you feel it in your body? And how do we reconnect you? Because that's the voice you need to be listening
Yeah, I
to. And so
think.
that's a lot of how I.
And you know
Mm-hmm.
what is important, because I think people, if they have experiences, might be able to then start recognizing that and reconstruct their reality and trust in themselves, right? Like you said, it's about learning to trust ourselves, our own intuition, our sensation, the warning signs we did get because they were there and often ignored. And I think the gaslighting also means that they're excellent at making you feel that it was your fault what happened, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
just to give an example of how this happened at the end in my relationship, where I think I'd got the third text breakup in 4 weeks, basically, which were when I came there. And this is interesting because they often have this out of mind, out of sight, right? Meaning that
Yep.
when I was there, she would be, "Oh, I love you more than anyone." I would go home. 2 days later, I would get a text breakup out of the blue, and then when I saw her next
Yeah.
week, "Oh, I love you," and then a text breakup. And then the interesting thing was at the end. Then we talked about not text breakup. Then I got another one, of course. And then the next day, I got an email saying, "Oh, I'm with another partner now anyway, and I'm really happy. Take care. Have a good life."
Oh,
Literally
jeez.
24 hours later. And then, of course, I got upset. I said, "What is the point of sending me this except trying to cause me pain to break up by text and then emailing me that you're now with somebody else?" 20 that there's no point of doing this except causing pain. And then she replied by saying, "Oh, you would have got upset anyway, whether I did this or not." And that is a good example of gaslighting, on somebody trying to
Mhm.
make you feel that you have been the one who did something wrong and you were the one who were unpleasant, etc. And actually, because I was so confused at that point, I bought into it. And later, when I reflected, I thought, what a lot of nonsense. No, if she said with me kindly and said this relationship is over, I would have been sad but not angry at all. And so this is just an example of how often gaslighting comes across, right? Where somehow they find a way to make it sound like you did something wrong and you were the one who did something.
That's right. Yeah, because they will typically take the blame for nothing, take zero responsibility, and if they do it verbally, they don't do it in their actions. But yeah, that's a beautiful example. It's a very subtle form of gaslighting. It's not this, intentional, changing things in your environment to freak you out. And but there are, and if you have someone who's intentionally doing it, it is a huge red flag. You're in a relationship with a very dangerous person.
Yeah.
But yes, it's just their instinct. It's just how they make sense of the world. They're constantly gaslighting because that's the only way they can keep a coherent sense of self together.
Yeah, these are fantastic, I think, for people to just also be able to reflect if they had a relationship like this and start being able to see it, I think can be very, very healing, and realize that no, there's nothing wrong with you, and you don't have to take responsibility. And also I think an important part of the healing process is turning that compassion and empathy that we have towards ourselves, right? Because often people are so empathetic towards their narcissist or borderline or sociopath, that partner, and they really want to help them, but we forget to have that compassion with ourselves and are so harsh and judgmental. And I think take all that compassion and empathy and show that to yourself, because we really need it to go through that healing process. And I know one thing that was healing for me too was to kind of understanding the typical patterns of the ending of these relationships. Is that something you would be able to also talk a bit more about, how normally this goes at the very end when things, start going really wrong and we're moving towards the
Woo!
breakup?
Yeah, and a word, ugly. It's almost always ugly and explosive. Um, and it is absolutely, yeah. There, and it's if you're getting divorced and literally having to go through legal, proceedings, these are just the craziest legal battles, but they're vicious. And it's almost like these personality types. It is in their nature that they have to destroy you and make you the enemy to have to feel good about themselves. They have to destroy you. They have to prove that you were the bad guy because they cannot take any blame for this. And so it becomes just explosive. It's an explosive. Sometimes they will just, up and disappear. But usually there's this huge turning around and trying to destroy you psychologically to keep them together psychologically.
Yeah, and I think that's so true. It's a bit like you said, them being able to feel that they can stay in that identity and that story that they created, right? Of that they have been done wrong, they're the victim.
That's
So
right.
again,
That's
play
right.
into that victim, so they cannot. And also, like you mentioned, the splitting of black and white, that they don't see the gray areas, which pretty much is all of life is the gray area. That
Yeah.
again, if suddenly they had to admit fault, that meant they also had to paint themselves all black and admit that they were all bad in their own world. And of course, nobody
Yeah.
wants to perceive themselves as all bad. So therefore, they have to deny. While for me, I can admit that I done something wrong or made a mistake, but I know that doesn't make me an all bad person, right? Well, because they can't do that, they just can't accept accountability. So trying to make them understand they've done something wrong just doesn't work.
Exactly. Exactly.
And I think also
Yes.
a pattern I heard a lot is this, and I wouldn't say it's particular to the condition of narcissism borderline, but it's very common. I heard that they line up a replacement. So again, what I experienced, I heard from hundreds of other people now, because again, they need somebody to help regulate their emotions and feel sense of identity and give them that validation, right? So it's very
Yep.
common that a replacement is lined up before
Oh, yes.
we actually get the breakup text or whatever it is, or get blocked, and that there is never
Absolutely.
any closure. I hear people always say, I want closure, and I think people keep going back and say, oh, but I just want to, and I did this in the beginning for a few weeks, and think I want closure. They cannot give you closure, because often they're not
Mm-mm.
even aware of this and they don't understand what's happening. Closure can come from going to a therapist, listening to a podcast like this, go do our own work, but they cannot give closure. And I just think that's really important to like you said, to know and be aware of. And also the smear campaigns, like you said, they often have to destroy you afterwards and will talk bad about you, might make
Yeah.
false accusations, which is very common. I experienced this myself too, and I read
Yep.
many similar stories. And I would always say it's a good idea to keep a trail of written things that have been sent, just because it could be important in case things, like you said, in a divorce or where things go legal, etc., to have that, or police is involved. I know really extreme accusations that has happened to
Yep.
us people. So yeah, just a little reminder for that as well. And I guess once we experience this, it's quite common that we're stuck in that. We talk about the addiction and also what people call trauma bonding. Are you able to talk a bit about what that is? What is this trauma bond that might develop between people if they've been in an abusive relationship?
So the trauma bond is when you end up bonding with the abuser in an emotional way where you begin to actually take on a lot of their beliefs and views and about yourself. And so you see yourself the way they do. And so there is this bond, though, that forms that even though you're getting very injured and hurt, and this is so toxic for you, you can't let go because you have bought into enough of the reality that the abuser has been selling you. And you see yourself as the one who needs to be, more perfect so that they don't have to lose their temper or whatever it might be. So you buy into their story that you're the one who's the problem, needs to change, and so you can't leave because you feel guilty and bad often. And so you end up staying, trying to keep making yourself fit whatever crazy mold they have. But honest to God, it's usually a moving target. So what they needed last month is not the person they need, tomorrow, and you're expected to conform and shift, and you're punished if you don't. So you end up end up stuck in this, and it's that, intoxicating honeymoon hopes of that returning to that is what keeps you, in the largest sense there. But there was this bonding that happens. And that is why it's just so important when you end up in that type of relationship to have a good sounding board where you're telling somebody the whole story and they can help you see what's up and what's down, because it really does get confusing how much of it is you, how much of it is them. The other paradox is, because there is some truth in all of that. So if you want to break the cycle, not be in a relationship like this ever again, you need to look at what was your half where you got yourself pulled into this, and to really, so that you can't be fooled basically again, because there is an element of it where you miss some of those warning signs. So you have to go back and look at your half and figure out where you got pulled into this crazy cycle, and so that you never ever do it again. And I think if you go people who go and do their homework, it actually becomes a very easy pattern to spot once you get yourself and your, vulnerabilities, and you look at why you get pulled into this, why you needed that level of validation, whatever it was that got you kind of hooked in the beginning. And once you clean that up, you will be so turned off by these folks, and you will see them coming a mile away. Um, that, I think if you do your homework, it's very easy to break the pattern.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important point you bring up, because I always say to people, I think it's so important to go get therapy after a relationship like this, because as you said, yes, it's normal that we all obviously like somebody validating us, looking up to us, accepting us as part of just human psychology, but also a lot of people that end up, especially if it's a repeated pattern, to get in relationship with somebody with cluster B personality disorder, then I think it's really important to look at what are the patterns that are dragging you in, because maybe, people do have certain wounds that make them receptible, and why they ignore these warning signs because they have such a strong need for having these sensations, etc. Right? So I think it can be wonderful opportunity to start healing those old wounds. And like you said, once we do that, we will look at this and think, oh, this is actually really unappealing behavior. And also work on boundaries, because I think a lot of people that are very empathetic, and this doesn't apply to all, but a lot of people also often struggle a bit with boundaries and feel, are very people pleasing, which is why they're great for example, the borderline and the narcissist, because they often will give them and keep feeding them into this black hole, like you said, right? That they want, but also
Yep.
it means that it becomes very receptive, because once we can't set boundaries, they will keep stepping further and further and further. So start doing work on boundaries. And I know I did something with a somatic therapist, which was wonderful, for even simple exercises where he would work towards me and I would just say stop, and I would say no, go back, and I would control the distance and start sensing what felt comfortable, and how could I control the space between how close and how distant. Just simple things like this to work in therapy was really useful to start learning to re-enhance those boundaries again and start sensing them more clearly.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the one thing I always like to highlight too is that, and it's weird when you've been in an abusive relationship, because on the one hand, it's the paradox is you need to see that abuse has happened and you were wronged. But another half, I don't want to also say you were totally powerless, because then that makes you a victim, right? That's not good either. So and so understanding that you control that half of the dance. And what's really bizarre, because I've been a therapist for a while, is that I've had so many clients who get out of an abusive relationship, often too quickly get into a new one, and they're like, so and so's 180-degree different, nothing like my ex. And that's when I'm like, oh God. But they haven't changed enough of their patterns. And within 1 to 2 years, they are back in a relationship that is eerily similar. Because what happens in any relationship, you're going to start feeling vulnerable or unsafe at certain points. And the truth is, you have learned from your childhood how to respond to that vulnerability. Some of us go pursuing the other person, try to make things better. We people please, you know, where others, they learn to cope with feeling vulnerable in a relationship by distancing and shutting down and putting up a wall. So we all have our patterns. And until you learn to shift that pattern, manage those behaviors, like you're saying, in terms of like setting boundaries, it's really eerie, because you're bringing your half of the relationship of coping with intimacy, you're bringing that exact pattern into this new one. And you will often end up with a person who started out totally different, doing the exact same things that happened in your last abusive relationship. And it is absolutely eerie, how often I see that as a therapist. So it's so important. Usually I tell everyone to take some time off between relationships, look at your half, learn how to set boundaries like you're describing. And then you're finally in a position to, even because you're going to only be attracted actually to these super charming folks. That's part of the problem. They're so charming in the beginning. So you're not attracted to someone who's not who's not super charming like these abusive personalities are. So you really have to do some shifting inside so that you can be attracted to a healthy personality.
Yeah, I think that is so important. And taking the time to grieve and actually heal and process what has happened too. We often want to just run to the next to try and numb that emotion too, right? Because it can feel so
Yep,
painful.
exactly.
And I really like the saying, it's okay to not be okay. We don't have to feel great all the time, even though we always pursue that. That we need to
Yep.
welcome all our emotions, and even the painful ones are probably telling us something. I think what was beautiful for me was feeling into and allowing my anger to feel that, where I felt, oh, I shouldn't be angry. I should just forgive. And actually allowing that anger in therapy was wonderful and very, very healing, because anger is just an emotion that tells you that you're being violated. And it's actually
Hmm.
really important to be able to listen to that. It doesn't mean that we have to act on it, but we have to be able to listen to it and recognize it, right? So finding a way to try and process all these emotions that have just trying to tell you something, I think can be so beneficial. But Diane, we could speak for hours. We're already gone over an hour, so I want to finish up. But before I do, if people really enjoyed this and they want to work with you, find out more information about you, where can they find you on the internet?
Yeah, you can find me on my website, which is www, and it's Diane, Diane, and the last name is GEHART.com. And I do talk about these personality types in my book, A Mindfulness for Chocolate Lovers. And so, yeah, I encourage everyone, if this has piqued your interest or you think you might be dealing with some of these issues, to definitely get help. It is so freeing and liberating when you do.
Yeah, and we don't have to keep reliving the same patterns. Thank you so much, Diane, for coming on the podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed the show today. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and come back for our new weekly podcast. Also, leave a review to keep the positive energy going. That really keeps me motivated to make more of these podcasts. If you want to learn the key skills to a safe, intimate, and passionate relationship, then head over to Zensensa.com and join the free 1-hour webinar. The link is in the description. You'll learn the 4 reasons that relationships break down, how your attachment style may fuel conflict with your partner, and how to break that cycle, why people cheat and the 1 tip that can prevent it, the simple 3-step formula to lasting love. So thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you next week for another podcast.